In the early morning hours of April 28th in the year 1903, the earth under the town of Manzikert in what is now eastern Turkey began to shake violently. It was sudden, intense, and completely unexpected. A powerful earthquake struck the region, reaching a surface wave magnitude of 7.0. For the people living there, it must have felt like the end of the world. Manzikert, which today lies in Mus province, sits in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. The ground beneath eastern Turkey is under constant pressure because it lies along the boundaries of major tectonic plates. The Arabian plate is pushing into the Eurasian plate from the south, while the Anatolian plate, which holds most of Turkey, is being squeezed and pushed westward. This collision zone has produced earthquakes for thousands of years and still does today. Back in 1903, there were no early warning systems. People had no way to prepare for what was coming. The shaking began without warning, and within minutes, homes, buildings, and entire neighborhoods had crumbled. The earthquake caused massive destruction across the region. 12,000 homes were completely destroyed. Not damaged, gone, flattened. For people living in rural villages with simple stone or mud brick homes, there was no protection when the earth turned violent. The shaking was so strong that the ground split in places, and landslides were triggered in nearby hills. Thousands of animals, over 20,000, died, many crushed in collapsed barns or caught in the chaos that followed. For a region that relied heavily on agriculture and livestock to survive, losing that many animals was not just a loss of life, it was a loss of livelihood. But the most heartbreaking toll was the human one. An estimated 3,500 people were killed in the disaster. Entire families were wiped out in an instant. Survivors were left digging through the ruins with their bare hands, searching for anyone who might still be alive. The sound of weeping and shouting filled the air in the hours after the shaking stopped. Nearby cities and towns like Erzurum and Bitlis felt the earthquake too. Though the damage there was less severe, buildings cracked and panic spread. Roads and trails used for travel became blocked by debris, making rescue efforts even harder. And because this was the early 20th century, there were no helicopters, no quick emergency teams. Help came slowly, by foot, by cart, or not at all. The people of Manzikert had no choice but to rely on each other. Neighbors helped neighbors, even while grieving their own losses. Makeshift shelters were set up using whatever materials could be found. Fires were lit to keep warm at night, as many were forced to sleep outside in the cold. The strong aftershocks kept coming, making it impossible for people to feel safe indoors. This earthquake would go on to be remembered as one of the deadliest in Turkish history. But it was only the beginning of the hardship. The full impact of the 1903 Manzikert earthquake would be felt for years to come. As the days passed after the earthquake struck Manzikert, the damage began to reveal itself even more clearly. Survivors who had crawled out from collapsed homes began walking through their villages, seeing entire streets reduced to rubble. Stone walls had collapsed inward, roofs had caved in, and the narrow dirt roads were blocked with debris. In many places, there was nothing left standing. The landscape looked as though it had been torn apart by war. Relief was slow to arrive. In the early 1900s, the region was isolated. With limited infrastructure, there were no paved highways or motor vehicles. The only ways to reach Manzikert were by foot, horseback, or donkey carts, and the trails were damaged or blocked by landslides. News of the earthquake spread slowly. Weeks went by before help from distant cities began to trickle in. In the meantime, the survivors had to rely entirely on local resources. Many had lost everything. Families were now homeless, living in temporary shelters made from wooden planks and canvas, or huddling in caves and open fields. With their livestock gone and food supplies buried under rubble, hunger and illness started to take hold. Clean water was scarce, and without proper sanitation, diseases quickly began to spread. It was no longer just an earthquake disaster, it was now a humanitarian crisis. The psychological toll on the survivors was heavy. Every aftershock brought fresh fear. People were afraid to sleep indoors, even in buildings that were still standing. Children cried at the sound of the ground rumbling, and adults kept one eye on the horizon, watching for dust clouds that signaled a new collapse or landslide. Entire communities were gripped by fear and uncertainty. Beyond Manzikert, the earthquake was felt across much of eastern Anatolia. In cities like Erzurum and Bitlis, the shaking caused damage to important structures. Mosques, markets, and schools showed signs of cracking, and some smaller buildings collapsed. Though the destruction was not as complete as in Manzikert, it served as a reminder of just how far-reaching the earthquake had been. Even regions not directly in the epicenter were affected economically and emotionally. In the countryside surrounding Manzikert, farmers were devastated. The land had shifted, irrigation systems were damaged or destroyed, fields were torn apart, and in some areas, the soil had been displaced so badly that planting crops was no longer possible. Entire growing seasons were lost. Combined with the deaths of 20,000 animals, it meant that famine was now a looming threat. The Ottoman authorities at the time did what they could, but the response was limited. There was no central disaster agency, no stockpile of supplies, no formal rescue teams. Aid depended heavily on local governors, religious leaders, and community volunteers. Donations were sent from neighboring provinces, and religious institutions helped organize relief, but resources were stretched thin. The disaster exposed the vulnerability of rural communities in eastern Turkey. Most homes had been built from sun-dried bricks or local stones, materials that stood no chance against a major quake. The collapse of these homes wasn't just a matter of strength. It was a sign of how unprepared the region was for a natural disaster of this size. In the weeks that followed, the people of Manzikert began the slow process of digging out what they could. Personal belongings were retrieved from the ruins, but for many, there was little to find. Entire family histories, photos, books, heirlooms had been buried or burned. Yet amid the loss, there were small moments of hope. People who had been presumed dead were found alive, buried under beams or inside pockets of collapsed rooms, rescued by neighbors who refused to give up searching. The memory of the 1903 Manzikert earthquake would remain etched in the minds of the survivors for the rest of their lives. But this was only the early phase of a much longer journey. Recovery would take years, and the scars left by the earthquake, both physical and emotional, would run deep. Months after the earthquake, the people of Manzikert were still struggling to return to anything close to normal. The summer heat arrived, bringing with it new challenges. With so many buildings destroyed and clean water supplies either buried or contaminated, sanitation had become a serious problem. Flies gathered around waste and rotting animal carcasses that had not been properly buried. Sickness was spreading rapidly. Typhoid and dysentery were common. With limited medical knowledge and no modern hospitals nearby, even treatable illnesses became deadly. The destruction of homes and livestock had left thousands of people dependent on whatever help they could get. Food shortages were growing worse. Crops planted earlier in the spring had withered in fields that could no longer be properly irrigated. Entire harvests had failed. Families were now relying on donated grains, dried fruits, and whatever animals they had managed to save. The loss of 20,000 animals was not just a number. It meant fewer plows, no milk, no transportation, and no meat for entire communities. Despite the devastation, some rebuilding efforts had started. Using what materials they could find, wood, salvaged bricks, mud, people began putting up temporary homes. These makeshift shelters offered little protection against the weather, but they were a sign that the town was not giving up. Stonemasons and laborers came from neighboring villages to help, even though many of them had suffered losses themselves. In the absence of formal engineering knowledge, homes were rebuilt in much the same way they had been before, leaving them just as vulnerable to future quakes. Religious leaders played a big role during this time. Mosques that had survived the shaking became gathering places not only for worship, but for organizing food distribution and community decisions. Clerics gave sermons focused on strength and perseverance, and many people found comfort and faith when there was little else to hold onto. Beyond the town itself, the government had begun taking notes. The Ottoman Empire, still in its final decades, was under pressure from multiple sides, financially, politically, and militarily. Natural disasters like the Manzikert quake only added more stress. Officials sent reports back to Istanbul detailing the destruction, and engineers were dispatched to evaluate the damage. While resources were limited, the disaster helped push the discussion about earthquake risks into broader political conversations. Meanwhile, researchers of the time began paying closer attention to the geology of the region. Though modern seismology was still in its infancy, it was becoming clear that eastern Anatolia was resting on unstable ground. Scientists noted that the region was close to the junction between two major fault systems, the East Anatolian Fault and the North Anatolian Fault. These faults were now being studied more closely, and there were early theories forming about the movement of plates and how stress in the Earth's crust could build over time until it suddenly released in a violent quake. In addition to the main earthquake in April, there were multiple aftershocks over the following weeks and months. One of the more powerful ones struck on the 6th of August, causing new damage to buildings that had survived the initial quake. Some people who had started rebuilding saw their homes collapse again. A few were injured, and the fear that had briefly started to fade came roaring back. Many residents began questioning whether it was even safe to remain in the region. Despite the suffering, people found ways to survive. Communities worked together, sharing tools, food, and even space. Entire families moved in together under single roofs. Children played in the dust and rubble, finding moments of laughter amid the hardship. Weddings were still held, funerals still observed, and markets slowly reopened. Bit by bit, life was continuing, even if it looked completely different than before. For the people of Manzikert, the earthquake had not just destroyed buildings, it had changed the rhythm of their lives, shifted their priorities, and forced them to rethink how they would live in a land that could shake without warning. But they kept going, one day at a time, trying to rebuild not just their homes, but the future. In the years that followed the 1903 Manzikert earthquake, the tragedy stayed fresh in people's memories. Survivors carried the weight of what they had seen and lost. Family members buried under collapsed roofs, animals crushed in barns, entire neighborhoods wiped off the map. The ground beneath their feet had once felt solid, dependable. Now every tremor, every creak of a shifting house beam sparked a fear that was hard to forget. Across the region, this earthquake became one of the key moments that helped shift how people understood natural disasters. Before then, earthquakes were often seen as acts of fate or divine punishment, unpredictable and unavoidable. But the scale of the Manzikert disaster forced people to ask new questions. Could something like this happen again? Was it possible to prepare or even to prevent such destruction? At the time, formal earthquake science was still very limited, especially in eastern parts of the Ottoman Empire. There were no warning systems, no emergency response plans, and little public understanding of how earthquakes worked. But slowly that began to change. Scholars and engineers began paying more attention to the fault lines running through the Anatolian region. Reports were written, diagrams drawn, and early versions of risk maps were developed by experts in Istanbul and abroad. The Ottoman government, though strained and declining, did begin to gather more earthquake data. They compiled damage reports from towns like Manzikert, Erzurum, and Bitlis. These records would later help future researchers understand which parts of the country were most at risk. The memory of the 1903 disaster also started conversations about the need for safer buildings, though large-scale changes in construction would not fully come into place until decades later. Even without modern engineering, local builders and masons began to change their methods. In the years after the quake, new homes were often made shorter with thicker walls and stronger support beams. People experimented with new materials when they gained a when they could get them, hoping to avoid the same total collapse if another quake hit. Though these improvements were small, they marked the start of a long journey toward earthquake-resistant design. The disaster also left behind lessons in human resilience. Communities that had been torn apart slowly rebuilt themselves. Fields were planted again. Children born after the quake grew up hearing stories of survival and loss. Local traditions of sharing and mutual aid grew stronger. In some villages, neighbors formed informal watch groups that kept an eye out for signs of danger, shifting rocks, strange animal behavior, or unusual ground movement. Manzikert itself never forgot what happened. For decades, the earthquake remained part of its identity. Stories were passed down from elders to children, describing the moment the earth cracked open and the dust swallowed everything. The quake had reshaped more than just the land. It had changed the way people lived, worked, and thought about their future. Across Turkey, the Manzikert quake is now remembered as one of the earliest major disasters of the 20th century. It helped lay the groundwork for future efforts in earthquake preparedness, though progress would take many years. By the end of the 20th century, more than 100 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or greater had struck the country, killing more than 100,000 people and injuring many more. Each one added new urgency to the call for safety and preparedness. And today, Turkey has modern seismology centers, early warning systems, and strict building codes in many regions. These advances were not born overnight. They came from decades of hard lessons, of loss and recovery, and the 1903 Manzikert earthquake was one of the earliest and most painful lessons of all. The scars left behind by that earthquake are no longer visible in rubble, but they remain in the country's memory. They remind us of the quiet danger that lives beneath our feet and the strength that people can find when everything falls apart. Most people don't think of clouds of asbestos when they picture a small mountain, town in Montana, but that's exactly what happened in Libby. a place that looked quiet and peaceful on the outside, but underneath the surface was hiding one of the worst environmental disasters in American history. This wasn't just some factory spill or short-term issue. What happened in Libby stretched across decades, poisoned the air, the soil, and even the water, and changed thousands of lives forever. It all started back in the early 1900s, when settlers arrived in the area. The mountains surrounding Libby were rich with minerals, and the discovery of a shiny, flaky mineral called vermiculite in the year 1919 quickly turned Libby into a busy mining town. Vermiculite might not sound exciting, but it was a big deal. When heated, it expanded and became light and fluffy, making it perfect for everything from insulation to soil conditioners, even packaging material. By the time the 1960s rolled around, Libby's mine was producing around 80% of the world's vermiculite, but there was a hidden danger buried in that shiny mineral. Mixed in with the vermiculite was a naturally occurring and deadly form of asbestos known as tremolite actinolite. Now, asbestos isn't dangerous when it's untouched, but once it's disturbed, like it would be in a mine, the tiny fibers become airborne. If those fibers get into the lungs, they can cause serious illnesses like asbestosis, lung cancer, and a rare but aggressive cancer called mesothelioma. The thing is, these diseases don't show up right away. It can take decades for symptoms to appear, which made it even harder for people to understand what was happening to them. In the early years, people in Libby had no idea they were breathing in anything dangerous. They just knew there was always a lot of dust. The mine sat just outside town, and that dust would drift into the streets, homes, schools, and playgrounds. Workers came home from long shifts with their clothes and skin coated in gray powder, hugging their families and spreading asbestos fibers unknowingly. Children played on contaminated fields, and some families even used leftover vermiculite from the mine for landscaping or insulation. Nobody warned them. Nobody told them the truth. The company that first mined vermiculite in Libby was Zonolite. They had started operations in the 1920s and kept growing bigger. But by the year 1963, a larger company called W.R. Grace & Company had taken over, and that's when the real tragedy started to unfold. By then, workers were already getting sick. Internal reports from as early as the mid-1960s showed that the company was tracking employee health issues. One report even listed names of employees with abnormal chests, a quiet way of noting severe lung problems. Many of those workers would later die of lung disease. Despite all this, nothing was done. The mine kept operating. People in town kept living with the dust. And even when someone got suspicious and asked questions about the so-called dust disease, they were usually brushed off. Some were told the mine only had tremolite, not realizing that tremolite was one of the deadliest forms of asbestos. One miner even remembered feeling completely blindsided when he found that out, saying, "We're not geologists. Nobody up on that hill knew what tremolite meant." The truth stayed buried for decades, and while the mine finally shut down in the year 1990, the damage had already been done. By the late 1990s, an alarming number of people in Libby were getting sick, and local doctors started raising red flags. The town that once prided itself on hard work and natural beauty was now dealing with a full-blown health crisis, and that was just the beginning. As the years went by in Libby, Montana, life seemed to carry on like normal, but behind the quiet mountain town charm, a deadly threat was growing stronger every day. It wasn't just the miners who were breathing in dangerous asbestos dust. It was their families, neighbors, and anyone who lived nearby. As the mining trucks moved back and forth from the hills, a fine powdery dust blew through the streets, coated homes, and settled in yards. People walked through it, kids played in it, and no one realized just how toxic it really was. By the early 1960s, the mine in Libby was producing over 80% of the world's supply of vermiculite. The mineral was everywhere, used in homes, gardens, and buildings across the country. But this particular source of vermiculite had a hidden contaminant, tremolite actinolite, one of the most toxic forms of asbestos. Inhaling just a tiny amount of it could eventually cause serious illness, but that wasn't common knowledge at the time. Most residents thought the dust was just part of life in a mining town. Even worse, mine waste was often handed out to the public for free. It was used to line driveways, fill potholes, build playgrounds, and even as soil in community gardens. People thought it was a useful resource, never suspecting it was full of deadly asbestos fibers. Kids slid down piles of the dusty waste after school. Local businesses unknowingly tracked it inside on their shoes. Churches, schools, and backyards were built on top of contaminated land. As time passed, more and more people in Libby started to feel sick. The illnesses didn't hit right away. Sometimes it took decades for symptoms to show up. Many residents experienced shortness of breath, constant coughing, or unexplained fatigue. Some were diagnosed with rare diseases like mesothelioma or asbestosis, which are directly linked to asbestos exposure. And these weren't just old miners nearing retirement. Many were young, healthy people who had never stepped foot in the mine. Doctors in town began noticing patterns. Lung issues were popping up in people who had no other risk factors. Families were losing loved ones without understanding why. By the time most people got a diagnosis, there was little anyone could do to stop the damage. And still, no official warnings were issued to the public. For decades, there were no signs posted around town, no public announcements, no testing. People continued living, working, and raising families in an environment that was slowly poisoning them. And although there were hints that the company behind the mine, W.R. Grace & Company, was aware of the risks, they continued to keep quiet. Internal reports dating back to the mid-1960s mentioned abnormal chest x-rays in workers and rising concerns about lung disease, but nothing was shared with the public. It wasn't just about sickness. The emotional toll was massive. Families lost mothers, fathers, siblings, and children. Entire households were affected. People who had trusted their community's main employer now felt betrayed. They had been left in the dark for too long, and by the time help arrived, the damage had already spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Still, the full extent of the disaster hadn't come to light. At this point in the story, the town of Libby was dealing with growing health problems, a rising number of unexplained deaths, and no real answers from those in charge. But the worst part? Most of the country had never even heard of it. The story of Libby was about to change, just not in the way residents had hoped. In the late 1990s, the town of Libby was still suffering in silence. Decades had passed since the mine first opened, and by now, hundreds of people had either fallen ill or passed away. Yet outside of Montana, hardly anyone knew the town existed, let alone the slow-motion disaster happening there. That changed when a Seattle-based journalist named Andrew Schneider received a tip from a source about a small town dealing with a strange cluster of lung diseases. Schneider began digging. What he found shocked him. Medical records, internal company memos, and reports from former employees pointed to a major health crisis tied directly to asbestos exposure. In November of the year 2000, he published a series of articles in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer that exposed what had been hidden for so long. The headlines were blunt, the facts were horrifying, and finally the outside world was paying attention. The Environmental Protection Agency responded quickly. Within weeks, a team of EPA investigators arrived in Libby to begin testing soil, air, and even the insulation in homes. What they found confirmed Schneider's reporting: widespread contamination throughout the town. Even places that had no direct link to the mining site were testing positive for deadly asbestos fibers. This discovery led to one of the most aggressive environmental cleanup operations in U.S. history. The EPA declared Libby a public health emergency in the year 2009, the first time in its history that such a declaration was made for a single town. By then, thousands of residents had been exposed to dangerous levels of asbestos for decades. At the center of the crisis stood W.R. Grace & Company. As the owner of the mine, the company had long claimed it operated within the law, but internal documents now uncovered told a different story. Memos from as far back as the early 1970s mentioned concerns over dust levels, rising medical costs, and worker health problems. Some records even suggested efforts to downplay the risks or keep information from reaching the public. One of the most powerful voices to come forward during this time was a former mine manager named Robert Locke. He admitted under oath that he had been instructed to withhold certain safety information and had helped the company avoid drawing attention to the health hazards. His testimony became a key piece in the case that followed. In the year 2005, the United States Department of Justice indicted 7 current and former executives from W.R. Grace & Company. They were charged with conspiracy, fraud, and knowing endangerment. Prosecutors argued that the company had placed profits above lives, choosing silence over responsibility. The trial became a major national news story. People across the country were finally hearing the name Libby and understanding just how long its residents had suffered. Despite all the evidence and emotional testimony, the outcome of the trial surprised many. In the year 2009, all 7 individuals were acquitted of criminal charges. The jury found that the government had failed to prove that the men knowingly put lives at risk. While the legal case was over, the public outrage continued. For the people of Libby, the verdict felt like a second betrayal. But the exposure of the disaster had changed things. Federal aid began flowing into the town, medical screenings were expanded, cleanup crews were sent to remove contaminated insulation from homes, schools, and public buildings. And perhaps most importantly, the story of Libby forced a national conversation about the dangers of asbestos and the importance of environmental oversight. The damage, however, was already done. The physical toll couldn't be reversed, families had lost too much, and even as cleanup efforts began, residents had to live with the knowledge that their town would never be the same. After the criminal trial ended in the year 2009, the people of Libby were left to deal with the aftermath. While the verdict had disappointed many, the town's fight for justice wasn't over. Libby was now the focus of one of the largest and longest-running environmental cleanup efforts ever carried out by the United States government. Over the next decade, the Environmental Protection Agency worked to decontaminate schools, homes, parks, and businesses. Specialized crews removed tons of asbestos-contaminated soil, tore out old insulation, and replaced it with safer materials. It was a massive operation that took years, and it was only possible because the town had finally been heard. In addition to the physical cleanup, the federal government took a rare step. Congress passed legislation that gave Libby residents access to long-term health care. Under the Affordable Care Act, a special provision was added specifically for victims of the asbestos exposure in Libby. This made them eligible for federal benefits to help with medical costs, including treatment for asbestos-related diseases. It was a small but significant win for the community, proof that their voices had finally reached Washington. A local clinic, the Center for Asbestos-Related Disease, or CARD, became a lifeline for many families. Doctors there specialized in diagnosing and treating asbestos illnesses. They also helped gather data to better understand the long-term effects of the contamination. What they found was heartbreaking. People who had never worked in the mine, including children and spouses of miners, continued to show signs of illness. In some cases, the asbestos exposure came just from playing in a backyard or handling clothes covered in dust. These stories showed how far the contamination had spread and how deeply it had affected the town. Despite the progress, Libby faced another challenge: its identity. For years, the town had been defined by what happened there. News reports, documentaries, and books told the story of a place poisoned by asbestos. Tourism dropped, property values fell. Some residents moved away to escape the constant reminder of what had been lost, but others chose to stay and rebuild. They planted new gardens, restored old buildings, and created events to bring the community together again. Slowly, Libby began to shift from a story of tragedy to one of resilience. The local high school started teaching students about what had happened, not to dwell on the pain, but to ensure it was never forgotten. Public art projects were launched to honor the victims. One mural downtown shows a family standing strong together, surrounded by trees and mountains. It's a symbol of what Libby had endured and what it continues to overcome. Today, Libby is still recovering. Some places remain off limits due to lingering contamination, and for many, the health problems remain, but the town is no longer silent. It has become a case study for environmental justice, a reminder of what happens when profit is valued over safety and what it takes to fight back. The legacy of Libby lives on in court rulings, environmental policies, and medical research. It also lives on in the strength of its people. Their voices, once ignored, changed the law, forced government action, and brought national attention to an invisible killer. Libby's story is a hard one. It is full of loss, anger, and unanswered questions, but it is also a story of courage, of a small town that refused to be forgotten. The summer of 2003 marked an unprecedented natural disaster across Europe. The heatwave that would go down in history as one of the most severe and deadly heat events the continent had ever experienced. Temperatures soared to extreme levels, reaching more than 40 degrees Celsius in many areas, and in some places the heat persisted for days on end. The heat wave was particularly harsh in countries like France, Spain, Portugal, and Italy, where the high temperatures were not only record-breaking, but also relentlessly persistent. It quickly became clear that this wasn't just an ordinary summer heat, this was a crisis, one that would claim more than 70,000 lives across Europe. In France, the impact of the heat wave was especially severe. The country's typical mild summers were no match for the scorching temperatures that engulfed the nation. Cities like Paris, known for their pleasant summer weather, found themselves under a relentless heat dome, with temperatures rising well above 40 degrees Celsius for multiple days in a row. In fact, the highest temperature ever recorded in France at the time, 44.1 degrees Celsius, was a shocking reminder of just how extreme the heat had become. This sudden and extreme shift in weather took many people by surprise. Unlike other parts of the world, France was not equipped to handle such intense heat, especially in residential areas where central air conditioning was rare. The heat wave in France did more than just make the air unbearably hot. It brought health risks that many were unprepared for. Dehydration, heat stroke, and heat-related illnesses surged, particularly among the elderly and young children. With hospitals quickly overwhelmed, it became clear that the French health system was not prepared for an event of this magnitude. The death toll from this heat wave in France alone reached over 14,000, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in the country's history. But France was not the only country feeling the heat. Across southern Europe, the effects were widespread and devastating. In Spain and Portugal, the heat wave led to similarly catastrophic outcomes. Temperatures soared to near 50 degrees Celsius in parts of Spain, and the combination of intense heat and drought created the perfect conditions for wildfires. These fires ravaged forests, destroyed homes, and took lives. In Portugal, nearly 2,000 people died due to the heat, with rural areas bearing the brunt of the damage. The situation was worsened by freak storms that swept through the southern regions, further increasing the danger and disrupting already fragile infrastructures. Even the typically cooler northern parts of Spain were not spared, as temperatures soared to levels never before seen, breaking decades-old records. The heat wave was not just a weather event, it was a major public health emergency that exposed the lack of preparedness across many countries in Europe. Most of these nations had not considered such extreme heat to be a serious threat, as their climates were not typically prone to such high temperatures. For instance, in the United Kingdom, temperatures reached an all-time high of 38.5 degrees Celsius. While this may not sound as extreme compared to other countries, it was the highest temperature ever recorded in the UK at the time. The heat put immense pressure on healthcare systems, utilities, and governments, all of which scrambled to cope with the health crisis and infrastructural challenges posed by the relentless heat. As this intense period of heat continued into August, it became clear that the impact was far-reaching. The severe temperatures were exacerbated by the urban heat island effect, particularly in large cities like Paris. The heat island effect occurs when cities, with their buildings, roads, and limited greenery, trap and retain heat, making them even hotter than surrounding rural areas. This made it difficult for residents to escape the oppressive heat, particularly at night when temperatures remained high, providing little relief. The European heat wave of 2003 not only tested the resilience of communities, but also highlighted the need for urgent changes in how countries handle extreme weather events. The health consequences were just the beginning. What was happening across Europe was a preview of the kind of climate challenges that the future might hold if action wasn't taken to prepare and adapt. But at the time, no one could have predicted just how far-reaching the effects would be. As Europe baked under the scorching sun, the true magnitude of the disaster began to unfold, setting the stage for the even more devastating days to come. As the heat wave stretched into August, it became clear that the conditions were far from ordinary. The combination of high-pressure systems and persistent southerly winds from the Sahara Desert resulted in a relentless wave of heat across Europe. This heat was not just uncomfortable, but dangerous. The conditions were so extreme that many regions were breaking temperature records that had stood for decades. In France, for example, the temperature reached an astonishing 44.1 degrees Celsius, which was the highest temperature ever recorded in the country. This extreme heat became a serious health risk for many, especially the elderly, young children, and those with pre-existing health conditions. For countries like France, where the summers were typically mild, this sudden surge in temperatures caused a major public health crisis. In many areas, people simply weren't prepared for this kind of heat. Air conditioning was not common in most homes, particularly in the northern regions of France, where summers were rarely this hot. As a result, many people had no way to cool down, making them vulnerable to heat-related illnesses like heat stroke and dehydration. The situation was worsened by the urban heat island effect, where cities, with their dense concrete and asphalt, absorbed and retained heat more than rural areas, making the temperatures in cities even hotter. The heat wave in France led to over 14,000 heat-related deaths, with most of the victims being elderly people who were unable to cope with the extreme heat. The situation was dire, and as temperatures climbed higher, hospitals and emergency services found themselves overwhelmed with people suffering from heat-related illnesses. This strain on the health system delayed treatments, which only added to the death toll. In some places, the government took action, setting up helplines for concerned citizens and providing information on how to stay cool and hydrated, but by then the damage had already been done. In Portugal, the heat wave was equally catastrophic. A combination of high temperatures and dry conditions led to widespread wildfires, with the intense heat fanning the flames and making them harder to control. The record-breaking temperatures, with nighttime lows still above 30 degrees Celsius, caused further stress on both people and infrastructure. In addition to the human toll, the agricultural sector also took a massive hit. The drought created crop shortages affecting food production across the region. The damage to agriculture led to long-term economic consequences, and as the heat wave raged on, the consequences of the extreme weather became painfully clear. Across Europe, the heat wave was leaving its mark not just in the form of heat-related deaths, but also in terms of the damage to infrastructure. Many countries experienced power outages as the demand for electricity soared, with air conditioning units working overtime to try and keep buildings cool. The strain on power grids was intense, and the infrastructure in many areas was simply not built to handle this level of demand. The agricultural sector was not the only one affected. Water shortages also became an issue as rivers and lakes, which were crucial sources of water for both drinking and irrigation, began to dry up. These extreme conditions, however, were not limited to just one or two countries. The heat wave spread across much of Europe, with countries like Spain, the Netherlands, and Germany also experiencing devastating heat and drought. The Netherlands, for instance, recorded temperatures as high as 37.8 degrees Celsius. This was close to the national record, which had stood for more than a century. This unusual heat was felt in both urban and rural areas, and just like in other affected countries, the elderly were particularly vulnerable. While the heat wave did not break records in every country, the intensity and length of the event were unprecedented in most places. In Germany, the heat caused severe disruptions in shipping on the Elbe and Danube rivers. Low water levels, a result of the ongoing drought, made it difficult for ships to navigate. This not only impacted transportation, but also affected the economy, as fewer goods could be moved via these critical waterways. Similarly, power plants in countries like Germany had to reduce their output due to the high water temperatures in rivers, which made it unsafe to cool their reactors. With the combination of heat and drought affecting so many sectors, the broader economic impact was becoming undeniable. As the temperatures stayed high and the situation worsened, it was becoming clearer that the aftermath of the heat wave would be felt long after the weather returned to normal. The 2003 heat wave was not just a summer event, it marked a turning point in how Europe would approach extreme weather. It revealed how vulnerable many countries were to such events and exposed the gaps in public health systems, emergency preparedness, and infrastructure. The intense heat, the health risks, and the economic toll made it clear that something needed to be done to prevent or mitigate future disasters. As the heat wave continued to ravage Europe, it became apparent that the extreme weather was having a profound effect on the environment. Forests, fields, and farmlands, which were already under strain from the lack of rainfall, were now facing the additional burden of record-high temperatures. The drought was especially devastating for crops, and the effects were felt across much of the agricultural sector. In countries like Spain and Italy, where agriculture is a key part of the economy, the consequences were immediate. Fields of wheat, corn, and olives dried up, and many farmers faced the tragic reality of losing their harvests. The economic toll was significant, with billions of euros in damages across Europe's agricultural industry. The heat wave also led to an increased risk of wildfires. With the combination of dry vegetation and high winds, the stage was set for catastrophic fires to break out. In Portugal, the situation became dire as fires spread rapidly across the country, fueled by the dry conditions and intense heat. The fires threatened both rural and urban areas, and thousands of people had to be evacuated from their homes to avoid being trapped by the flames. The firefighting efforts were complicated by the extreme heat, making it harder to control the fires and protect homes and infrastructure. Portugal was not alone in facing these dangers. In Spain, Italy, and France, wildfires broke out as well, leading to further evacuations and destruction of property. The fires not only claimed lives, but also caused significant damage to the natural environment, with vast areas of forest and wildlife habitats being destroyed. Wildlife was another group that suffered severely during the heat wave. The drought reduced the availability of food and water for many species, forcing animals to seek out new areas for survival. In some regions, animals were found wandering in urban areas searching for water. The heat also put stress on aquatic life, with rivers, lakes, and streams drying up or reaching dangerously low levels. Fish and other aquatic species were at risk due to the increase in water temperature, which led to oxygen depletion in some bodies of water. The delicate balance of ecosystems across Europe was disturbed, and many experts warned that the long-term effects on biodiversity could be severe if such heat waves became more frequent. The situation was further complicated by the human response to the heat. As temperatures soared, many people took to rivers and lakes in an attempt to cool down, only to find that these bodies of water were already dangerously low. The lack of water made it harder for people to stay hydrated, which only contributed to the rise in heat-related illnesses. Hospitals continued to be overwhelmed, and while many governments provided resources to assist the public, the scale of the crisis made it difficult to address every need. Additionally, the heat wave had significant long-term consequences for Europe's infrastructure. As the ground dried out, the earth beneath roads and buildings shifted, causing cracks and structural damage. Railway tracks were especially vulnerable, with some sections buckling under the extreme heat, disrupting travel. The heat caused concrete to crack and asphalt to soften, leading to delays and safety concerns on the roads. Airports in many regions experienced delays as ground crews struggled to deal with the heat, and air travel became less reliable. The cost of repairing the damage to infrastructure was enormous, and many European countries found themselves facing bills that stretched into the billions. The economic losses did not end with agriculture and infrastructure. The heat wave caused significant problems for the tourism industry as well. In countries like France and Italy, where tourism is a major part of the economy, travelers stayed away due to the unbearable heat. Resort areas and historical sites saw fewer visitors, and many outdoor events were canceled due to the risk of heat-related health problems. On the flip side, there was a rise in demand for air conditioning and cooling systems, leading to a spike in sales, but this only added to the strain on power grids. Perhaps one of the most sobering outcomes of the 2003 heat wave was the realization that climate change could be a driving force behind such extreme events. Scientists and climate experts began to warn that as global temperatures continued to rise, Europe could expect more frequent and severe heat waves in the coming decades. This prompted governments across the continent to take a closer look at their climate policies and disaster preparedness plans. While the heat wave eventually subsided, the lessons learned from this disaster were far from forgotten. European governments began to implement measures aimed at mitigating the impacts of extreme weather, including heat action plans, better urban planning to prevent the urban heat island effect, and investments in green technologies. The aftermath of the 2003 heat wave highlighted the vulnerability of Europe to extreme weather events and underscored the importance of both local and global efforts to combat climate change. The severity of the heat, its economic consequences, and the toll it took on human and animal life left a lasting impact. It was no longer a question of whether such events would happen again, but rather, when. The heat wave in its wake set the stage for greater awareness of climate risks and the urgent need for adaptation strategies to protect both people and the planet from the intensifying impacts of climate change. As the years passed after the intense heat wave of 2003, Europe began to adapt to the rising threat of extreme weather. The lessons learned from that summer would inform a series of responses aimed at minimizing the impacts of future climate events. One of the most significant changes was in the way cities approached urban planning and environmental sustainability. In the wake of the heat wave, many European cities began to incorporate more green spaces into their urban landscapes. By creating parks, rooftop gardens, and increasing tree cover, cities hope to reduce the urban heat island effect, which causes cities to be much warmer than surrounding rural areas due to the dense concentration of buildings and human activity. Many governments also took steps to improve early warning systems for extreme weather. Heat waves, which had previously been seen as occasional anomalies, were now recognized as potentially life-threatening events. Across Europe, national meteorological services worked to enhance their forecasting abilities, while health departments developed heat action plans to protect vulnerable populations. In some countries, special measures were introduced to ensure that elderly people and those with pre-existing health conditions had access to cooling centers and could avoid the dangerous heat. Hospitals also ramped up preparedness to manage heat-related illnesses, including heat stroke and dehydration. In addition to heat-related precautions, there was a growing emphasis on reducing carbon emissions to combat climate change. Following the extreme heat of 2003, the European Union and its member states intensified their efforts to meet climate goals, aiming to limit global warming. Renewable energy sources such as wind and solar power began to receive more attention and investment, with the EU setting ambitious targets for reducing carbon footprints. The development of energy-efficient technologies and the promotion of public transportation helped decrease reliance on fossil fuels, which contributed to both global warming and the frequency of extreme weather events. Farmers, too, took action in response to the harsh conditions that had devastated crops during the heat wave. In countries where agriculture was a key industry, new farming techniques were introduced to help adapt to changing climate conditions. Drought-resistant crops were developed and tested, and irrigation systems were upgraded to conserve water. Additionally, many farmers invested in technologies to monitor weather patterns and soil moisture levels, which helped them make more informed decisions about planting and harvesting. These measures aim to increase resilience and ensure that European agriculture could survive and thrive, even in the face of increasing climate uncertainty. Despite these efforts, the memory of the heat wave remained vivid, and many were still grappling with the lingering effects. Water shortages were a continuous concern, and many regions began to explore new methods for water conservation and management. The drought conditions, which had plagued large parts of Europe in 2003, had become an ongoing challenge. Countries began to invest in desalination plants and other water-saving technologies to ensure that they could meet the growing demands of both their populations and their agricultural sectors. As the climate continued to change, the conversation around heat waves and extreme weather shifted from being about recovery to being about preparation. No longer were such events seen as rare occurrences, but rather as inevitable risks that needed to be planned for. Governments focused not just on reducing the immediate damage caused by heat waves, but on developing long-term strategies for climate adaptation. This included improving the resilience of infrastructure, investing in renewable energy, and enhancing public health systems to deal with the ongoing threats posed by extreme weather. While the heat wave of 2003 had been an unprecedented event, it was no longer an isolated incident. In the years that followed, other European countries experienced similarly devastating heat waves, leading to the realization that climate change was not just a future threat, it was already here. The lesson of the heat wave was clear: extreme weather events, fueled by rising global temperatures, would only become more frequent and intense, and it was up to governments, businesses, and individuals to prepare for the inevitable. In conclusion, the heat wave of 2003 served as a wake-up call for Europe. It forced the continent to confront the reality of climate change and the profound impact that extreme weather can have on human life, ecosystems, and economies. The widespread devastation it caused in terms of loss of life, crop failure, wildfires, and infrastructure damage was a turning point in how Europe understood its vulnerability to climate change. The steps taken in the aftermath of the heat wave, from changes in urban planning to the promotion of renewable energy, set the foundation for a more resilient Europe. While the long-term consequences of climate change remain uncertain, the lessons from that summer continue to guide efforts to protect the planet and its people from the increasing threat of extreme weather. In the days leading up to the deadly typhoon that struck Hong Kong in the early morning hours of Tuesday, September 18th of the year 1906, there was no real sign of the devastation that was about to unfold. Life in the city was moving along like usual. Hong Kong at the time was a growing British colony and a busy international port. Streets were filled with people going about their day, shopkeepers opening stores, boats crowding the harbor, trams running through the heart of the city, and locals navigating their daily routines. There had been storms before, of course. Typhoons weren't new to the region, but this one would end up being one of the deadliest natural disasters in the city's history. The warning signs were subtle at first. The barometer began to drop steadily on the morning of the storm. Between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock that morning, the pressure fell from 29.74 to 29.28 inches of mercury. This might not mean much to the average person, but to those watching the skies, like the Hong Kong Observatory, it was clear that something serious was developing. Still, there wasn't much time. At 8:40 in the morning, a black drum was raised by the observatory, which was the official warning signal at the time for tropical cyclones. but this was barely 30 minutes before the full force of the typhoon hit. Unfortunately, this short notice left almost no time for preparations. By 9 o'clock, ferries had stopped operating, but it was already too late for many. Foreign steamer captains and their crews, stranded on land, had no time to reach their vessels and secure them. Some people didn't even realize the danger until it was upon them. That's how fast it moved. Despite some warnings being telegraphed days earlier from Japan and Shanghai, it wasn't until the morning of the 18th that most people in Hong Kong knew anything was wrong. It caught nearly everyone off guard. The typhoon itself had formed several days earlier, around Saturday, September 15th, near the Bashi Channel to the southeast of Hong Kong. It was first spotted by Japanese meteorologists east of Formosa, which is modern-day Taiwan. Ships passing through the Pacific Ocean also recorded changes in wind and pressure. But back in Hong Kong, where communication systems were limited and weather tracking was still a developing science, the urgency of those early warnings didn't make their way to the people in time. By the time the typhoon approached Hong Kong, it had grown into a powerful storm with winds swirling around a massive core. The eye of the storm was recorded just 30 nautical miles away, with wind speeds reaching 24 miles per hour as it neared the city. While that might not sound extremely fast, what made this storm deadly was its sheer size and intensity. The wind force extended across an area about 100 miles in diameter. The winds were violent, but the real damage came from what followed: the rising water, the massive waves, and the terrifying storm surge. As people in the city began to realize that this was no ordinary storm, panic set in. Boats were rushed to shelter if they could make it, markets shut down. People ran for cover, trying to find solid ground or shelter indoors. The skies grew darker and the air grew heavier. For many, it was already too late to escape what was coming, and still no one could have predicted how bad things would get. The typhoon was just beginning its path of destruction, and within hours, it would change the city forever. As the sun rose over Hong Kong on the morning of Tuesday, September 18th, the air was thick and unusually still. Most residents were completely unaware that a massive storm was racing toward the city. At around 8:40 in the morning, the Royal Observatory hoisted the black drum signal, a warning system used since the year 1884 to alert of approaching tropical cyclones. Just minutes later, the typhoon gun was fired at the harbor, sounding the alarm that danger was imminent. But by that point, it was already too late for many. The typhoon had moved in fast. In just 2 hours, barometer readings dropped rapidly, from 29.74 to 29.28 inches of mercury. That kind of drop signaled a sudden and extreme pressure change, a sure sign of the approaching storm's intensity. By 9 in the morning, ferry services had already come to a halt, and people were stranded all across the harbor. Many foreign steamer crews couldn't reach their vessels in time to prepare, leaving countless ships vulnerable as the storm swept in. The winds picked up with terrifying speed. The Hong Kong Observatory measured a velocity of 24 miles per hour when the eye of the storm was still 30 nautical miles away. That might not sound fast at first, but with a storm of this scale, those winds carried an unstoppable force. In a matter of minutes, the sea became a boiling mess of churning waves and crashing surf. Tidal waves slammed against the shoreline, flooding entire coastal areas before anyone had time to react. Along the waterfront, the rising water broke down sea walls, carried away small boats, and smashed wooden piers to splinters. The typhoon's full power became tragically clear as it hit during high tide. Thousands of people living in vulnerable coastal areas were directly in its path. For many Chinese families living on houseboats, some of the nearly 5,000 registered watercraft in the city, there was no escape. The storm struck so quickly that few could make it to shore. Along the stretch from West Point to Causeway Bay, sampans and lighters were tossed into one another like toys. Entire communities living on the water disappeared in an instant. By mid-morning, buildings on land were also being torn apart. Roof tiles and glass rained down into the streets. Electric tram lines on Hong Kong Island came to a stop when wiring systems were ripped apart. The Peak tram was also forced to shut down after damage to its signal cables and nearby tracks. On Bowen Road, fallen trees and debris made entire routes impassable. At the Botanical Gardens, many trees were destroyed, although the zoological section somehow made it through untouched. The storm showed no mercy. At West Point, major warehouses, including those owned by Jardine, Matheson, and Jebson and Company, lost their roofs and had their walls ripped away. Piers collapsed across the Central District, including the Star Ferry Wharf, Blake Pier, and Queen's Statue Wharf. Even newly constructed landmarks like the General Post Office and The Supreme Court site were heavily damaged, their bamboo scaffolding torn down and scattered across nearby roads. This typhoon didn't just damage a few structures. It overwhelmed every part of life in Hong Kong, from transportation and housing to public safety and communication. And all of it happened in just a few short hours, leaving the city in shock and on its knees. But as devastating as this was, the true scale of the disaster would only become clear as people began searching for loved ones in the wreckage. Next, we'll look at the tragedy that unfolded in the harbor, with ships sunk, hundreds of lives lost, and heroic rescues carried out in the middle of the storm. As the typhoon continued its assault on Hong Kong, the waters of Victoria Harbor turned into a deadly trap. The chaos reached its peak between 10 in the morning and noon, when winds blew with hurricane force and the sea surged over the seawalls. The harbor, normally a place of trade and activity, became unrecognizable. Massive waves rose up without warning, some said to be over 30 feet high, crashing down on vessels of all sizes. More than 200 ships and boats were damaged or sunk. Among them were ferries, cargo steamers, and fishing junks. The Chung Shan, a large steamer, was thrown from its mooring and slammed into the dockside before capsizing. The Yunnan, another vessel anchored near Kowloon, broke free and collided with smaller boats before vanishing beneath the waves. The Japanese freighter Asama Maru, caught in the path of the storm while attempting to leave port, lost control and drifted until it struck a pier. Its hull was badly damaged, but it managed to remain afloat. Countless smaller boats were not so fortunate. Entire fleets of sampans, which served as both homes and workplaces for many families, were shattered by debris or dashed against sea walls. Witnesses later described seeing people clinging to pieces of wreckage or trying to swim through oil-coated water, screaming for help as strong currents pulled them under. The sounds of splintering wood and cries for rescue echoed through the harbor. Rescue efforts began while the storm still raged. British Navy personnel from the HMS Tamar risked their lives by launching lifeboats into the rough water, pulling dozens of people to safety. Police and fire crews also worked to save those trapped on the docks and in partially sunken ships. Some managed to haul survivors up by ropes and ladders, even as the wind threatened to blow them into the sea themselves. Others could only watch helplessly as overturned boats floated past with no signs of life on board. One of the most heartbreaking scenes unfolded near Aberdeen, on the southern side of Hong Kong Island. A fleet of fishing boats had tried to take shelter in the narrow inlet there, but the wind shifted suddenly and a massive wave surged into the harbor mouth. Within minutes, more than 40 boats were overturned or crushed together. Entire families were lost, including children and elderly relatives who had been asleep below deck when the storm hit. As the winds finally began to weaken around midday, the damage was already staggering. Oil from damaged freighters spread across the water, mixing with floating debris, splintered wood, and unclaimed belongings. The sea, once the heart of Hong Kong's lifeline, had become a floating graveyard. The worst was not yet over, though. Survivors began emerging from shelters, only to find their homes destroyed and loved ones missing. With communication lines down and roads blocked, news of the disaster spread slowly. It would take several more days before the full human cost became known. As we wrap up, we'll explore the impact on land, how entire neighborhoods were flattened, how hospitals struggled to keep up with the wounded, and how the government began the long and painful process of recovering from one of the worst typhoons in Hong Kong's history. In the aftermath of the typhoon, the people of Hong Kong faced a long road to recovery. In the weeks that followed, efforts to clear debris and restore order were carried out mostly by hand, using basic tools. Communication lines had been knocked out, and it took days before messages could be sent to nearby cities for assistance. Supplies were slow to arrive. What little help did come had to be delivered by sea, as many roads were blocked or destroyed. The colonial government conducted an inquiry to understand how the storm had caused so much damage and loss of life. Reports from that time revealed not only the limits of existing infrastructure, but also how ill-prepared the region was for a storm of that strength. The storm pushed the city to think more seriously about long-term planning. In the years that followed, improvements were made to breakwaters and harbor facilities. More attention was given to weather observation, and the typhoon warning system was gradually expanded. But for the people who lived through it, the typhoon left a permanent scar. Many survivors lost their homes, their families, or their livelihoods. For fishermen and harbor workers in particular, the disaster was devastating. Some left the region entirely, while others stayed and rebuilt, one wall at a time. The 1906 Hong Kong typhoon is still remembered today as one of the deadliest natural disasters in the city's history. It highlighted the need for better preparedness, better infrastructure, and better understanding of nature's power. While the city has grown into a modern metropolis over the past century, the memory of that storm remains a reminder that even the most advanced societies are never fully in control when it comes to the force of nature. The summer of 2010 was a strange and deadly one for many parts of the world, but nowhere felt the heat more painfully than Russia. What started out as an unusually warm spring quickly spiraled into one of the most intense and deadly heat waves ever recorded in modern times. By the time it ended, more than 55,000 people had lost their lives. Over 9 million hectares of farmland were scorched, and parts of the country were burning in record-breaking wildfires. But this disaster wasn't just bad luck, it was the result of a series of events that had been building up for months. It all began with a global weather pattern shift known as El Niño. From June of 2009 to May of 2010, a moderate El Niño warmed up the ocean currents and started changing weather all across the northern hemisphere. That's what kicked off the first wave of unusual heat in places like the United States, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, China, North Africa, and large parts of Europe and Russia. But that was only the beginning. Right after that, another global weather event took over. This time it was La Niña, and it was much stronger. Starting in June of 2010 and lasting through the next summer, this La Niña event was one of the strongest ever recorded, and it hit hard. Powerful anticyclones, basically large high-pressure systems, started building up across the northern hemisphere. In Russia, one of the biggest anticyclones parked itself right over Siberia. It didn't move for months. That created a kind of atmospheric traffic jam. The hot air just sat there, baking everything underneath it. By June, the temperatures were already rising fast. Across the eastern United States, the Middle East, northeastern China, and especially in European Russia, the heat became unbearable. Global weather stations reported that June was the fourth warmest month ever recorded. In the northern hemisphere, April to June was the warmest stretch ever documented on land, more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit above average. But it wasn't just the temperature that made things bad, it was how long it lasted. Normally heat waves come and go, but this one just stayed day after day, week after week. It didn't rain. The wind didn't blow. The air didn't move. By the end of June, the soil was already drying out. Farmers started noticing their crops were wilting, and then the fires started. The heat wave officially kicked off in Moscow on June 27th. The temperature hit 91 degrees Fahrenheit, way above what anyone was used to there, and it stayed high for days. Throughout the rest of that week, the thermometer didn't drop below 90. Other parts of the country started heating up too. In Yakutia, deep in Siberia, the temperature hit over 95 degrees, which was extremely rare. The roads were so hot, city workers in Moscow had to spray them down with water, just to stop the pavement from melting. By the end of June, over 1,200 people had already drowned in Russia. Many of them were just trying to cool off in lakes, rivers, or canals, but the heat made people careless. Emergency officials said that many of the drowning victims had been drinking or swimming in unsafe spots. Still, nobody thought things would get as bad as they did. At that point, it was just hot. Dangerously hot, but it wasn't yet a full-blown disaster. That would come soon. As the heat wave tightened its grip across Russia in the summer of that year, records began to fall one after another. Cities that usually saw mild, comfortable summers were suddenly dealing with temperatures well above normal. In Moscow, the thermometer climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, an extreme number for a place that typically stays far cooler during that season. Across central and western Russia, asphalt buckled, rivers dropped to alarmingly low levels, and power grids came under intense strain. The intense demand for air conditioning and cooling systems pushed energy use to all-time highs. In many areas, the electrical infrastructure simply couldn't handle it. Blackouts rolled through towns and cities, leaving thousands without power during the hottest days of the year. In rural areas, the situation was even worse. Many small villages lacked modern cooling systems altogether. Elderly residents and young children were the most vulnerable. With no relief from the brutal heat, the number of heat-related deaths began to climb rapidly. Hospitals struggled to manage the growing number of patients suffering from dehydration, heat exhaustion, and related complications. Even at night, temperatures refused to drop, giving people no break from the intense heat. Sleeping became difficult, tempers flared. The emotional and physical stress took a toll on the population. For many, it wasn't just the temperature, it was the feeling that something was seriously wrong. This wasn't just an unusually hot summer, it was a crisis unfolding in real time. As the heat wave continued into the heart of summer, Russia began to face a growing national crisis. Temperatures stayed dangerously high for weeks. Crops withered in the fields, hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland dried up, leading to widespread crop failure. Wheat, one of Russia's main exports, was hit especially hard. The government was forced to ban grain exports by early August of that year to protect its own food supply. That decision had ripple effects far beyond Russia's borders. Countries that depended on Russian wheat suddenly faced shortages, and global food prices began to rise. Within Russia, food prices also spiked, adding more pressure to families already struggling with the heat. In some parts of the country, shelves in local markets emptied quickly and panic buying set in. Fires burned through forests and peat bogs around Moscow and other central regions, releasing thick clouds of smoke. These fires weren't just destructive, they made the already unbearable air even more dangerous. The smoke settled over the capital, making it hard to breathe. Visibility dropped, people were told to stay inside. Hospitals filled up with patients suffering from heat stroke, breathing problems, and other heat-related illnesses. By this point, the situation had overwhelmed local authorities. Emergency services were stretched thin, entire towns were surrounded by flames. Volunteers and even local villagers worked alongside firefighters too. As the Russian heat wave dragged on, the environmental impact grew more severe. Forests, grasslands, and farmlands suffered from extreme drought. In many regions, crops failed entirely. Wheat fields that once stretched green across the landscape turned to dry, cracked dust. Russia, one of the world's largest grain exporters at the time, was forced to ban exports completely due to the poor harvest. This led to price spikes in global food markets, with ripple effects felt far beyond the country's borders. Air quality became a major concern. Thick smoke from widespread wildfires filled the skies, especially around major cities. The combination of extreme heat, stagnant air, and smoke created a choking haze. In some areas, visibility dropped to just a few hundred feet. Breathing became difficult, especially for those with asthma or other health conditions. The environmental damage didn't end with fire and drought. Wildlife also faced harsh conditions. Rivers and lakes dried up or became too warm to sustain fish populations. Insects and animals that usually thrived in cooler conditions struggled to survive. Entire ecosystems shifted in response to the intense and sudden heat, leaving scientists concerned about long-term effects. The Russian heat wave became a wake-up call for many around the world. Scientists and climate experts pointed to the event as a clear example of how global temperatures were changing. While no single weather event could be blamed entirely on climate change, the severity and duration of this heat wave fit into a growing pattern. For Russia, and for the rest of the world, it marked a moment where extreme weather could no longer be ignored. On January 15, 1919, in the north end of Boston, something unexpected was about to happen. A massive storage tank, standing 50 feet tall and 90 feet wide, filled with molasses, sat just outside the busy neighborhood. It was owned by the Purity Distilling Company and held over 2.3 million gallons of molasses, roughly 13,000 tons of the thick, sweet liquid. This molasses was used to produce ethanol, which would be shipped out from nearby factories. However, the tank itself was flawed from the start. The construction was rushed and its design was poor, with some saying it was built with subpar materials. Right from the beginning, it leaked molasses, and locals often joked about the sticky smell in the air. But no one imagined that this small, ongoing issue would lead to a catastrophe. As winter wore on, the weather in Boston had warmed up, causing the molasses inside the tank to thin out, making it more volatile. With the tank filled to capacity, pressure began to build. The combination of overfilling and the expanding liquid caused the tank to become unstable. The molasses was no longer just a sweet, harmless substance. It was now a ticking time bomb, ready to explode, and that explosion would be unlike anything the city could prepare for. On the afternoon of January 15, 1919, Boston's North End became the scene of unimaginable chaos. At around 12:30 p.m., without warning, the massive molasses tank that had stood in the area for months suddenly gave way. The steel walls of the tank burst open with a deafening roar, sending a wall of thick, brown liquid surging out at a terrifying speed. The Molasses moved with the force of a flash flood, racing through the streets at an estimated speed of 35 miles per hour. The wave of molasses, as much as 15 feet high in places, swept through the narrow streets, overwhelming everything in its path. The streets, once bustling with life, became a slippery, sticky mess. Buildings were battered by the sheer force of the wave, while cars and horses were quickly trapped in the thick molasses. The flood struck with such speed and power that many didn't have time to react. As the molasses continued to surge through the neighborhood, it trapped people and debris alike. Several homes, warehouses, and even train tracks were engulfed. People who were unfortunate enough to be caught in the path of the flood were swept off their feet, often unable to escape the overwhelming tide. The liquid, dense and heavy, trapped victims under its weight, making it difficult for anyone to get free. As chaos unfolded, cries for help echoed through the streets, but the molasses made rescue efforts incredibly difficult. Emergency responders and bystanders struggled to wade through the thick sludge, which was as sticky as it was dangerous. People who had been swept into the flood found themselves unable to move or breathe, unable to get free from the sticky grip of the molasses that held them fast. The scene was both terrifying and surreal, as the usually peaceful neighborhood was now in the grip of an unstoppable disaster. Once the molasses flood subsided, the full extent of the devastation began to unfold. The north end of Boston was left in ruins with wrecked buildings, overturned cars, and streets coated in a sticky, brown residue. The air was thick with the smell of molasses, which clung to everything it touched. The cleanup efforts would take weeks, but the impact of the disaster was far more than just physical. By the time the molasses flood had receded, a tragic toll had been taken. 21 people had lost their lives and over 70 others were injured. The victims came from all walks of life, from children playing in the streets to workers who had been near the tank when it collapsed. In the days that followed, the city was left to reckon with the loss of life, the destruction, and the trauma that would linger long after the molasses had been cleaned up. As the city began to recover from the chaos, the investigation into the cause of the disaster quickly became a matter of great urgency. The cause of the explosion was initially unclear, and authorities scrambled to understand how such a catastrophic event could have occurred. The molasses tank had been built by the Purity Distilling Company, a business that manufactured and stored molasses for use in alcohol production. Many speculated that the tank had been poorly constructed or improperly maintained, but it would take months for the full details to come to light. The first clue came when investigators found that the tank had been under immense pressure. The molasses inside the tank had fermented over time, which increased the pressure on the walls of the tank. This pressure likely contributed to the eventual rupture. However, the tank's design also came under scrutiny. It was revealed that the tank had been built with low-quality materials and had shown signs of weakness for months leading up to the disaster. The company had failed to take proper precautions to address these issues, even after the tank had exhibited signs of leaking. By the spring of 1919, the investigation led to a lawsuit filed against the Purity Distilling Company by the victims and their families. The case would eventually uncover not just a failure in engineering, but also a failure in oversight and accountability. The company's lack of concern for safety, as well as the poor construction of the tank, were deemed significant factors in the disaster. The legal battle would drag on for years, but the flood of molasses left an indelible mark on the city of Boston and its people, serving as a painful reminder of the deadly consequences of negligence. While the immediate aftermath of the molasses flood in Boston was filled with cleanup efforts and legal battles, the disaster left a long-lasting impact on the city and the surrounding community. The flood was not just a moment of chaos, but a turning point in how industrial safety and urban infrastructure would be approached moving forward. In the years that followed, Boston would make significant changes to both its building codes and its regulations regarding industrial facilities. The city's authorities, faced with public outrage and widespread fear, worked to ensure that such a tragedy would never happen again. The disaster brought into sharp focus the dangers of poorly constructed industrial structures in densely populated areas, especially those handling volatile materials. One of the major reforms that arose from the molasses flood was the increased scrutiny of industrial tanks and storage facilities. Prior to the flood, there were very few regulations governing the construction and maintenance of large storage tanks, particularly those used for the storage of liquids. After the disaster, the city enacted stricter guidelines for tank construction, including more rigorous inspections and higher safety standards. This was one of the first major steps in a larger movement toward industrial regulation that would continue to evolve throughout the 20th century. The impact of the flood was not just felt in Boston's legal and regulatory systems, but also in its culture. The Molasses flood became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked industrial growth. The disaster was a stark reminder of how progress and development, if not carefully managed, could lead to devastating consequences. In many ways, the Molasses flood was a wake-up call for other cities across the United States and around the world, highlighting the need for better planning, oversight, and accountability in industrial ventures. Additionally, the memory of the Molasses flood lingered in the collective consciousness of Boston residents. Many still remembered the eerie, sickly sweet smell that lingered in the air for weeks after the event. The flood was also a focal point for discussions about urban safety, as it was clear that cities needed to prioritize the safety of their residents as they continued to grow and industrialize. The flood would be remembered not just for its immediate tragedy, but for its role in shaping the future of urban planning and industrial regulation. The Purity Distilling Company, responsible for the tank, would eventually be absorbed by the American Molasses Company, which faced ongoing scrutiny in the wake of the disaster. Although the company never fully recovered its reputation, the incident left an indelible mark on the history of industrial accidents in the United States. The tragedy of the Molasses flood would be remembered as one of the strangest and most devastating industrial disasters in American history, reminding future generations of the importance of safety and responsibility in industrial design. The Boston Molasses flood of 1917 may have been a forgotten disaster for many years, but its effects continue to echo throughout history. As one of the most unusual and deadly industrial accidents in American history, the tragedy captured the imagination of people everywhere. Over time, the memory of the disaster faded from public consciousness, but it left behind lasting lessons on the importance of safety in industrial design, urban planning, and regulatory oversight. In the years following the disaster, legal actions were taken against the companies involved, though many of the victims' families faced years of legal battles and little to no compensation. The outcome of these cases varied, but the publicity surrounding the flood helped shape the future of industrial regulation in the United States. The government, as well as businesses, recognized the need for increased safety measures and better oversight in the face of rapid industrial growth. The site of the disaster, which had once been a bustling industrial area, would later be redeveloped. Over time, it became home to various residential and commercial buildings. The Molasses flood's exact location is now near the site of what is today known as the North End of Boston. The tragic events of that day may be distant in the past, but they remain an integral part of the city's history, symbolizing both the dangers of industrial negligence and the strength of a community in the face of adversity. Although many people associate the flood with its shocking and grotesque details, molasses coating streets and buildings, the sickening smell, the loss of lives, its legacy is not solely defined by the immediate horror. The Molasses flood helped spark a broader movement towards stronger industrial safety laws, especially in the years following the flood. The public's outrage played a key role in demanding change and pushed forward the evolution of workplace safety, labor rights, and environmental protections. To this day, the Molasses flood is often cited as an example of what can go wrong when regulatory systems fail to anticipate the dangers of industrial operations. It is a reminder that no matter how commonplace or benign a product might seem, when handled recklessly, it can have disastrous consequences. Though the flood is long over, the lessons learned from it continue to guide policy, law, and industrial safety standards to this day. The Molasses flood, while an almost surreal and tragic event, stands as a reminder of how powerful and dangerous human innovation can be when safety is neglected. It serves as a testament to the resilience of the people of Boston who rebuilt their city and, in time, turned an era of disaster into one of progress, ensuring that future generations would learn from the past. The memory of the Molasses flood will always remain a crucial chapter in the history of Boston and a warning to others about the importance of safety in the face of rapid industrialization. It all began on January 7, 2025. Southern California had been dealing with an unusually dry stretch, but that morning, everything shifted. Powerful Santa Ana winds swept through Los Angeles and San Diego counties, kicking off what would become one of the most destructive wildfire events in California's history. By the end of the month, 14 separate fires had burned across the region. These fires weren't just big, they were fast, hot, and impossible to control in some areas. Firefighters were up against wind gusts that reached 100 miles per hour in some spots. That's hurricane-level strength. The winds didn't just spread the fires, they tore down power lines, knocked over trees, and made it nearly impossible for ground crews to get close. On top of that, humidity levels dropped dangerously low, turning the region into a tinderbox. The conditions weren't exactly a surprise. Just a few days before the fires started, the National Weather Service had issued red flag warnings. Those warnings said it could be a particularly dangerous situation, especially in Los Angeles and Ventura counties. Forecast models were already calling for extremely critical fire weather, and those predictions turned out to be right on target. One of the first signs of trouble came earlier than most people realize. On January 1st, a small fire called the Lockman Fire broke out. It didn't do much damage, it burned only 8 acres, but it started in the exact area where the much larger Palisades fire would begin days later. That small fire was an early red flag, and it turns out it was a warning of what was coming. By January 3rd, the Storm Prediction Center was already forecasting an extremely critical fire risk for January 8th. These warnings don't come lightly. That same week, they began marking nearly every day in mid-January with at least a critical fire risk. From January 7th to 15th, Southern California had almost no break in fire danger, and that was just the beginning. By January 8th, the worst fears had started to come true. Fires were breaking out all across the southern part of the state. The two biggest fires, the Eaton Fire in Altadena and the Palisades Fire in Pacific Palisades, were already showing signs of becoming major disasters. Fueled by bone-dry vegetation, low humidity, and those intense Santa Ana winds, the flames moved faster than anyone expected. This wasn't just bad luck, it was the result of a perfect storm created over months, even years. Back in the winter before, California had experienced a period of unusually heavy rain. That led to a burst of plant growth all over the region. Grasses, shrubs, and other vegetation flourished. But then everything dried out. That green growth became kindling. Scientists later confirmed that climate change had played a huge role. According to researchers at the University of California, temperatures in 2024 had been unusually hot. Just the difference between the 2024 heat and the average temperatures since the 1980s accounted for 25% of the moisture loss that fueled the wildfires, and that estimate was considered conservative. Another analysis showed that the area was now up to 5 degrees Celsius hotter, up to 15% drier, and up to 20% windier compared to the mid-20th century. That combination made wildfires far more likely and far more dangerous, and because climate change has made California's wildfire season longer, it now overlaps with Santa Ana wind season. That overlap is exactly what happened here. The fires kept spreading. People had to move fast. Over 200,000 residents were evacuated across the region. Homes, neighborhoods, and entire hillsides were swallowed by flames. And tragically, at least 30 people lost their lives during the disaster. One of the hardest hit areas was Malibu's Carbon Beach, also known as Billionaire's Beach. Some of the richest people in California lost their homes in a matter of hours. Fires don't care how big or expensive a house is. When the wind is blowing that hard and the vegetation is that dry, there's not much anyone can do to stop it. By the end of the month, the wildfires had burned more than 57,000 acres and destroyed over 18,000 homes and structures. The total damage was estimated between $250 and $275 billion. That made the Eaton and Palisades fires likely the second and third most destructive fires in California history. Fire departments from all over the state responded. Cal Fire, along with local crews, worked around the clock. Tactical aircraft dropped fire retardant from above, while ground teams battled the flames directly. Still, it took until January 31st to fully contain the two largest fires. Meanwhile, back in Los Angeles, the city's fire department was already under pressure. Their budget had been cut by over $17 million just a few months earlier. That meant fewer hours for training, less brush inspection, and less equipment available. Even though they later received some added funding, that early budget cut made it harder to prepare for a disaster like this. To make things worse, fire departments all across the country were dealing with long delays in getting new vehicles. Prices had gone up, and supply chain issues meant departments were waiting months or even years for new trucks. All of this combined made firefighting efforts during these wildfires even more difficult. Another major problem was how older neighborhoods were built. Fire scientists pointed out that in places like the Palisades, most of the homes had been built in the 1950s and 60s. Back then, there weren't strict rules about fire-resistant materials, so you had wood frame houses, thick vegetation, and homes built close together, basically the perfect recipe for one house fire to spread to the next. In newer neighborhoods, California has building codes that require homes in fire zones to be made with materials that are less likely to burn. But those rules don't apply to homes built before the codes were put in place. That's one of the reasons why the fires spread so fast in certain areas. The electric grid also played a role. Some experts said the grid in Los Angeles was only designed to handle wind speeds up to 56 miles per hour. That's way below what actually happened. In some places, gusts hit 100 miles per hour. Utility companies didn't have a system to shut off power in high-risk urban areas, which might have prevented some fires from starting when power lines fell. And then there's the issue of homelessness. According to past reports, more than half of the fires the Los Angeles Fire Department responds to are connected to homeless encampments. It's not always intentional. Many start from cooking or trying to stay warm, but in dry conditions like these, a single spark near a tent can become a wildfire. Despite everything, local organizations stepped in to help. Groups like the Michael Spison Found Animals Foundation and the Better Neighbor Project started collecting donations and helping families who had lost their homes. It was a reminder that in the face of disaster, people still come together. By the time the fires were fully contained at the end of January, Southern California had been through one of its toughest months in recent memory. 14 wildfires had swept through neighborhoods, hillsides, and forests. Over 57,000 acres had burned. More than 18,000 homes and buildings were gone, and over 200,000 people had been forced to leave everything behind. The fires showed just how much the climate has changed. From strong rains that create more fuel to longer dry seasons and higher temperatures, every part of the environment now seems primed for wildfires. Scientists have warned that these events aren't going to be rare anymore. In fact, they're becoming the new normal. Wind speeds are getting more intense. Vegetation is growing faster than drying out quicker. Controlled burns, which help reduce fuel, are harder to schedule because there are fewer safe days to do them. And even though we have more advanced tools and forecasts than ever, fires like these move so fast, even the best teams struggle to keep up. The January 2025 wildfires were a wake-up call, a reminder that big disasters don't always start with explosions or earthquakes. Sometimes it's just one spark, a gust of wind, and a hillside covered in dry brush. And when all those things come together, the results can be devastating. As California continues to recover, the questions remain. How do we adapt? How do we build smarter? And how do we prepare for what's clearly becoming a longer, more dangerous fire season? Only time will tell, but for now, one thing is clear. This wasn't just another fire season. This was a warning.